What if the biggest victory you saw yesterday wasn't a victory at all, but part of a much larger design? Let me walk you through something that unfolded just this morning, something most headlines, analysts, and even casual observers are likely misreading. On the surface, it looks straightforward, but underneath, it's the result of a strategy that has been quietly developing for more than a decade. The uncomfortable reality is this: what happened over the last 24 hours wasn't chaos, it was calculated. Yesterday, it seemed like the story had reached its conclusion. The Strait of Hormuz, the most critical oil choke point in the world, was suddenly declared open by Iran. Markets reacted immediately. Oil prices dropped, stocks surged, and global media filled with optimism. Sarcastic. Even Donald Trump posted a triumphant, all-caps message of thanks, as if a major breakthrough had just been achieved. News outlets everywhere echoed the same sentiment. Tensions were easing, a deal was near, and the crisis was fading. For a brief moment, it appeared that the United States had secured exactly the outcome it wanted. Then came this morning. Without any warning, everything shifted. Iran reversed course. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stepped in and took full control of the strait again, not partially, not symbolically, but completely. Ships began turning back mid-journey. Tankers slowed, rerouted, or disappeared entirely from tracking systems. Reports surfaced of Greek and Indian vessels approaching the strait, only to suddenly change direction. One tanker even stopped broadcasting its location altogether. And then came the wording: precise and deliberate. Iran didn't describe this as military escalation or economic pressure. Instead, it labeled it piracy, maritime robbery, directly accusing the United States of unlawfully controlling international waters. This is the point where most people misunderstand what's happening. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction. It wasn't Iran suddenly changing its mind, and it certainly wasn't a random escalation. What unfolded over those 24 hours was the execution of a plan, one that could have been anticipated if you were looking beyond headlines and focusing on deeper global structures and power dynamics. This is exactly what I've been emphasizing from the very beginning of this conflict. Because the truth is, this situation has never been only about Iran's military capabilities. It's about something much broader and far more deliberate. It's about the system China has been quietly building over the past 10 years, a network of influence and leverage that reshapes how power operates. Within that framework, one thing becomes obvious. Iran was never going to surrender control of Hormuz on terms dictated by the United States. So here's what we're going to do. First, I'll break down, using simple logic, game theory, and patterns from history, why Iran's actions were not only predictable, but inevitable. Then, now that we've seen this plan in motion, I'll explain what likely comes next. Because what happened this morning isn't the conclusion of the story. It's the moment where the real story actually begins. Let's start with the prediction itself. What matters isn't just what was predicted, but how it was predicted. This isn't guesswork or personal opinion. It's a method. A straightforward but powerful way of thinking that allows you to move beyond reacting to headlines and instead anticipate outcomes before they happen. The method begins with a simple but brutally honest question. What does each player truly want? Not what they say in public statements or diplomatic briefings, but what they actually need at a structural level. In game theory, there's almost always a gap between declared intentions and real objectives. So let's look at the United States. Publicly, it says it wants the Strait of Hormuz open, Iran to step back from nuclear ambitions, and a return to stability through a negotiated agreement. That's the official narrative, the language of diplomacy. But beneath that, the real objective is different. The United States wants to prove something, not just to Iran, but to the entire world. It wants to demonstrate that it still controls the most important energy choke point on Earth, that it can pressure a regional power into submission, and that its military presence carries real, decisive weight. Because ultimately, this isn't just about oil routes. It's about credibility. If the United States cannot enforce its position in one of the most strategically critical regions in the world, then other global powers, from China to Russia, begin to question something far more significant: whether American power still holds the same meaning it once did. Now shift the perspective. What does Iran claim it wants? It talks about sanctions relief, access to frozen assets, sovereignty, and recognition of its role in the region. On the surface, these demands sound reasonable. Things that can be negotiated, adjusted, and eventually compromised. But if you look deeper, Iran's true objective is far more fundamental and long-term. What it really wants is to establish, once and for all, that the Strait of Hormuz operates under its authority, not temporarily, not conditionally, but as a lasting structural reality. It wants every tanker, every importing country, and every global market to internalize a simple fact. Passage through Hormuz happens on Iran's terms. The moment that becomes accepted in practice, everything shifts. Iran is no longer just a sanctioned state. It becomes an unavoidable gatekeeper, a country the world cannot bypass because global energy flows directly through it. And here lies the core conflict. These two goals, America's and Iran's, cannot exist at the same time. The United States cannot prove dominance over Hormuz, while Iran is asserting control over it. And Iran cannot cement long-term authority if the United States continues to deny its legitimacy. There is no middle ground here, no clever compromise that satisfies both sides. This is a binary outcome. One side defines reality, or the other does. That's why it was clear months ago that Iran would never surrender Hormuz on American terms. Not out of irrationality or a desire for endless conflict, but because giving it up would mean losing the one strategic leverage point that ensures its relevance. No country willingly gives up what makes it matter. That's not ideology. It's game theory. Yet Washington continued to operate as if pressure alone could override that logic, as if sustained military action could outweigh structural incentives, or as if a country fighting for long-term geopolitical survival would eventually break under short-term strain. But Iran didn't break, and what happened this morning proved it. What most people are still missing, however, is not just why Iran refused to back down, but how it was able to do so. Objectively speaking, Iran has been under nearly 50 days of intense pressure, levels not seen since the Gulf War. Its leadership has been targeted, its military stretched, and its economy pushed to extreme limits, with some internal estimates suggesting recovery could take years. By conventional standards, this is exactly the kind of pressure that should force compromise. And yet, Iran didn't hesitate. It didn't soften its stance. Instead, it confidently reasserted control over Hormuz and openly accused the United States of piracy. So the real question, the only one that matters now, is this. How does a country under that level of sustained pressure not just endure, but escalate with confidence? The answer to that question explains everything that follows. The foundation of that confidence can be traced to one word, China. But not China in the way it's usually discussed, not headlines, speeches, or formal alliances. What matters here is China as a system, an economic and strategic architecture quietly built over the past decade with a specific goal: to ensure that if a moment like this ever came, Iran would not collapse under external pressure. To understand this, you have to step back and look at what I call the decade of quiet. While the world focused on elections, conflicts, and daily headlines, something deeper was being constructed in the background. Once you see that decade clearly, Iran's actions stop looking surprising and start looking inevitable. This process began in 2018, when Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal and reinstated maximum pressure sanctions. The intention was clear: to isolate Iran, cut it off from the global financial system, and force it into submission. But at that exact moment, China made a quiet strategic decision. Not a public declaration, but a calculated move that many in Washington didn't fully recognize. China chose to become Iran's economic lifeline. This wasn't about ideology or alliance. It was about self-interest. A significant portion of China's energy supply, roughly 1/3, passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That means its entire industrial system depends on a narrow corridor historically influenced by U.S. naval power. China recognized the risk. If that corridor were ever fully controlled or weaponized by the United States, its economy would be dangerously exposed. So instead of reacting later, it began preparing early. Over the next decade, China built a parallel system, layer by layer, quietly and patiently. The first layer was financial. China began purchasing Iranian oil using its own currency rather than the US dollar. This may sound technical, but it's transformative. The global financial system largely runs on dollar transactions processed through networks like SWIFT, which the United States uses to enforce sanctions. By shifting away from the dollar, China created a channel where Iran could sell oil and receive payment without touching the US-controlled system. No dollar meant reduced leverage, and no reliance on SWIFT meant fewer points of control. Iran could continue exporting oil and sustaining its economy outside traditional pressure mechanisms. The second layer was physical, the logistics network often referred to as the shadow fleet. Over time, methods were refined to move oil in ways that are extremely difficult to track. Tankers would switch off tracking systems, change flags, or transfer oil between ships in international waters. In places like Southeast Asia, Iranian crude could be blended, relabeled, and reclassified as originating elsewhere. Official records might show no Iranian imports, but the actual flow of oil told a different story. The system wasn't just functioning, it was optimized. The third layer was strategic reserves. While all this was happening, China was quietly stockpiling massive amounts of oil. Estimates suggest between 1 and 2 billion barrels. Much of it was purchased at discounted rates from sanctioned countries like Iran and Russia. This wasn't just cost efficiency, it was strategic insulation. So when tensions rose and Hormuz became unstable, China remained steady. Its industries kept running while others scrambled. With months of supply already secured, it avoided the panic affecting other economies. When you step back, the picture becomes clear. A financial system that bypasses sanctions, a logistics network that hides supply, and reserves that absorb shocks. This is not coincidence, it's deliberate design. And this is why Iran can act with such confidence. It isn't operating in isolation, it's functioning within a system built to prevent external pressure from turning into internal collapse. So when Iran closes Hormuz again, escalates without hesitation, and uses strong language like piracy, that confidence is not sudden. It comes from years of preparation that largely went unnoticed. And once you recognize that, the real question shifts. From why Iran is acting this way to what happens when a system like this is truly tested. There is also a fourth layer, one that pushes this beyond economics into strategic capability, and that is space-based intelligence. Not in a science fiction sense, but in a practical military one. Satellite systems, including networks linked to Chinese commercial providers, have reportedly enhanced Iran's situational awareness. These systems provide high-resolution imaging and near real-time tracking of movements, infrastructure, and deployments across the region. This includes monitoring naval activity in the Persian Gulf and observing regional military positions. When combined with shared intelligence streams, potentially even incorporating data from partners like Russia, this creates a broader awareness network covering large areas around Iran. Modern analysts often point out that visibility on the battlefield increasingly determines vulnerability. If something can be seen, it can potentially be targeted. This doesn't mean constant conflict, but it changes how confidently a country can act when it is no longer operating blindly. Now connect all four layers: financial independence from sanctions, hidden logistics networks, buffered energy reserves, and enhanced surveillance capabilities. This is the decade of quiet, 10 years of steady, largely invisible construction. No dramatic announcements, no headline-grabbing alliances, just system after system built over time. So when Iran acted decisively in Hormuz, that confidence was built on top of this entire structure. Now, it's important to examine the American perspective as well. Many analyses fail because they only present one side. From Washington's point of view, the strategy is simple. Pressure works. Iran's economy is under strain, its currency has weakened, and long-term growth is affected. There are signs that sustained pressure is limiting its options. The United States has applied this pressure across multiple fronts: naval presence, sanctions, diplomacy, and military readiness. The idea is straightforward. Apply enough consistent pressure, and eventually, the other side has no choice but to negotiate. Historically, this logic isn't baseless. There are examples where sustained pressure contributed to major policy shifts, such as Libya's disarmament in 2003, or international campaigns during apartheid in South Africa. So the belief that pressure can work has precedent. But here's the key flaw. The American approach assumes that pain leads to collapse, and those are not the same thing. Pain means stress, economic hardship, pressure on systems, and internal strain. Collapse, however, means a system can no longer function or make independent decisions. The gap between those two states is exactly what this decade-long structure was designed to protect. Looking at Iran today, the distinction is clear. There is pressure, but there is no collapse. Oil is still moving, imperfectly, but enough. Revenue is still coming in. Systems are still functioning. Most importantly, Iran still has choice. It can decide when to escalate, when to pause, and when to negotiate. That ability to choose is critical. For weeks, the goal of maximum pressure was to remove that choice, to force Iran into a position where it had no option but to concede. But what we are seeing is the opposite. Iran is not being forced into decisions. It is making them. And the reason for that gap between pressure and collapse is the system supporting it. So what happens next? What we saw this morning was not random. It was a signal. And to understand it, we have to continue using the same framework: game theory, structural history, and real incentives. From here, there are three possible paths. The first is the outcome Washington is hoping for, that sustained pressure eventually pushes Iran to accept a deal before the ceasefire deadline. In this scenario, Iran calculates that continuing the conflict is more costly than compromise. Financial incentives, including access to frozen assets, become part of a negotiated framework. Both sides declare victory politically and publicly. But even in that case, the real outcome would not be in the headlines. It would lie in the structure of the agreement itself, because even if Iran appears to concede on the surface, it may still retain practical influence over the Strait of Hormuz. Navigation could still be coordinated, routes may continue to be influenced, and Iran's forces, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, could retain an operational footprint. From Iran's perspective, this would be framed as managed security, while the United States would describe it as freedom of navigation. Two different narratives, but potentially one shared reality. This resembles what could be called a Libya-style pathway, but with an important difference. In the case of the Libyan disarmament, Libya gave up its strategic leverage in exchange for limited long-term gains. Iran, operating in a very different structural environment, would aim to do the opposite: surrender the appearance of control while preserving the actual substance of it. And this is not just theory. It aligns with ongoing diplomatic efforts involving regional actors trying to contain and stabilize the crisis. The second possibility is a breakdown scenario. Negotiations fail, the ceasefire collapses, and the United States is forced into a decision it has been postponing: escalate further or pull back. Escalation would likely mean renewed strikes and a second phase of confrontation. But historically, conflicts rarely reset to zero after a pause. From the Gulf War to more recent regional wars, pauses allow systems to adapt. Infrastructure gets reinforced, strategies evolve, and recovery begins even during short lulls in fighting. The key insight here is that Iran does not need to remain fully intact to remain effective. It only needs enough capacity to respond, enough coordination, enough deterrence, enough resilience. If escalation resumes, the cost of the conflict changes. What may have seemed decisive in the first phase can become more expensive, prolonged, and uncertain in the second. Then there is a third scenario: an extended ceasefire that slowly hardens into reality without ever being formally declared. This is where China's role becomes most significant, not as a visible mediator, but as a quiet stabilizer operating in the background. China's interest is very specific: stability in Hormuz, uninterrupted energy flows, and a global system where no single power can fully dictate outcomes. It does not necessarily need a formal peace agreement. It benefits more from a steady, workable balance. If tensions cool just enough to keep oil moving, if Iran remains functional, and if the global system gradually accepts a multipolar structure in critical regions, then China achieves something far larger than a diplomatic win. The resolution of one of the world's most important choke points would not come through force alone, but through layered balance, built over time through structure rather than sudden agreement. In that scenario, what matters most is not what is publicly declared, but what is left unsaid. In strategic environments like this, silence itself becomes a signal. So attention shifts away from announcements and toward reactions, or the lack of them. When you step back, the bigger picture becomes clearer. The events of the last 24 hours stop looking chaotic and start looking structurally inevitable. The argument was never that Iran would give up Hormuz on American terms. From a game theory perspective, countries do not surrender the one leverage point that defines their global relevance. They act to preserve it. But that leverage was never just about Iran alone. It was not simply political will or ideology. It was infrastructure, built over a decade through systems quietly developed by China. Systems designed so that even under extreme pressure, Iran would still have enough economic and strategic breathing room to make its own choices rather than be forced into collapse. Think about what that system includes: payment channels operating outside the dollar system, reducing the reach of sanctions; Shadow shipping networks that allow oil to move even when official data suggests otherwise. Strategic reserves that absorb global shocks before they become critical. And increasingly sophisticated intelligence and surveillance tools that reduce uncertainty and improve decision-making. While Western policy focused on visible pressure, sanctions, military posturing, and public statements, China was building invisible resilience. Two different models of power. One immediate and reactive, the other long-term and structural. Then the shift became visible. Iran moved again in Hormuz, this time not hesitantly, but with confidence. In a single day, it demonstrated something important. Not superior conventional power, but the strength of structure itself. Outcomes in this system are not determined by force alone, but by preparation, networks, and layered support. Now the situation is defined by uncertainty. A ceasefire clock is running. Negotiations remain unstable. Different sides present conflicting interpretations of the same events. Movements in the Persian Gulf reflect hesitation rather than resolution. And behind it all, the most important actor is not loudly intervening. It is observing. Because when a system has been designed in advance, there is no need to react to every development. The structure already determines the likely outcome. This is not prediction, it is mechanics. A decade of quiet built a system where pressure creates strain but not collapse. Conflict generates tension but not surrender. And now the next phase depends on a single question. Does the United States recognize that this is no longer a two-player dynamic? Because when you try to interpret a three-player system as if it only has two participants, you will keep misreading the results. The real question is no longer whether Iran will surrender Hormuz. That question has effectively already been answered. The real question now is what comes next in the system that shaped this moment. If 1 decade of quiet construction produced this outcome, then what is already being built today that will define the next one? Because the decade of quiet did not end here. It is still ongoing.